Good evening, everyone. We're overwhelmed to see so many of you here tonight. My name is Jane Kirtley, and I'm the Silha Professor of Media Ethics and Law and also the Director of the Silha Center. And we're based at the Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at the University of Minnesota. We're thrilled to see so many of you here tonight, and we're also delighted to welcome approximately 1,000 people who are joining us via webinar, both in the United States and from around the world. This is our 40th annual Silha lecture, so it's quite an achievement for us. And tonight's lecture, as well as the operations of the Silha Center itself, are made possible through a generous endowment from the late Otto and Helen Silha. Members of the Silha family are with us tonight, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them for their support. I also want to quickly thank the members of the Silha Center staff who have made this evening possible, including Elaine Hargrove, our research assistants, and Meg Martin of the Minnesota Journalism Center, who also has provided us with some invaluable support, and we aren't even paying her salary, so thank you, Meg. And finally, I want to thank Steve Wolf. He is an old friend of mine going back to 7th grade. He's a Boston-based graphic artist, and he created our posters and other promotional material. And so thanks to him and to, of course, the staff here at Coles Auditorium. You're going to be hearing a lot about the current state of cartooning, the constitutional protection for editorial cartooning, and I don't want to tread on our lecturer's speech tonight, but I do just want to say that I'm going to start out by quoting former Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who said that the appeal of the political cartoon is often based on exploration of unfortunate physical traits or politically embarrassing events, an exploration often calculated to injure the feelings of the subject of the portrayal. If that was true in 1988, I would posit it's even truer in 2025. And I think you'll hear a lot of interesting things about what's going on in that regard. My students who are here and my colleagues know that I am a Luddite and I have great skepticism about AI. However, just for fun, I decided to plug into my computer today an AI question, which was, in the face of danger, in the face of suffering, laughter in the face of this, because it seems to me that that's what editorial cartooning is all about. And I actually got some interesting responses in the context of political cartoons. Laughter in the face of danger. This can include the use of humor by cartoonists to critique jihadis, autocrats, and other powerful and threatening figures, particularly in regions where such actions carry real risk. Laughter in the face of power. Satire is a potent weapon against those in authority. By ridiculing leaders, institutions, and ideologies, cartoonists can highlight their flaws and take them down a peg. It can be a form of resistance against authoritarianism and other forms of overreach. And laughter in the face of ridicule, when the primary intent of satire is not always to be funny, laughter can be a side effect and a bonus. When a political cartoon portrays a person or situation as ridiculous, it can prompt a laugh that reinforces the cartoon's message, showing the subject's own foolishness. And I think we need laughter today on top of everything else that we're thinking about. Anyway, I could think of nobody better to explore this topic than our lecturer tonight. Anne was born in Stockholm and became an American citizen when she was 13. She's a graduate of the Art Institute of California and specializes in animation drawing, and therefore quite naturally started with Warner Brothers before working at Walt Disney Studios. She then embarked on her career as an editorial cartoonist and collaborated with numerous publications, including the New York Times, Le Monde, and the Washington Post. She sketches both American and international politics. In 2001, she was the second woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for illustrated reporting and commentary. She's received numerous other awards, including the National Cartoonists Society's Reuben for Outstanding Cartoonist of the Year, and an international award, the EWK Award, named after a legendary Swedish cartoonist. She also received the Herblock Prize for editorial cartooning in 2023, published her first book in 2004. If you don't know her cartooning, if you haven't subscribed to her Substack, I can only encourage you to do so. She is at the moment perhaps best known for two things that occurred earlier this year. One was that after working at the Washington Post for more than 16 years, she resigned in January 2025 after one of her cartoons depicting Jeff Bezos, the newspaper's owner, was rejected. Then she was awarded her second Pulitzer Prize in May 2025. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome Anne back to the University of Minnesota. So Anne, come on out.
Thank you. I am truly honored to be here. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Jane Kirtley and also the Silha family for their kind invitation. And also to congratulate Jane on her retirement after 14 years working for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and 25 years with the University of Minnesota. On January 3rd, 2025, I quit the Washington Post after creating editorial cartoons for them for more than 16 years. It wasn't a decision I had planned or one that I took lightly. I believe that editorial cartoonists and satirists are vital for civic debate in a democracy. I've always taken my responsibilities as an editorial cartoonist seriously, so when Trump won re-election, I was determined to continue drawing cartoons which held him and his administration to account. But for the first time in my career, an editor prevented me from doing my job just because of who I chose to aim my pen at. That was a game changer and also a dangerous precedent for a free press and free speech. The cartoon that was killed criticized the billionaires who were trying to curry favor with President-elect Trump. There had been multiple articles leading up to the election about these men with lucrative government contracts and an interest in eliminating regulations. They posted congratulatory tweets, donated millions for his inauguration, and made pilgrimages to Mar-a-Lago. The group in the cartoon included Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, AI CEO Sam Altman, the owner of the Los Angeles Times, Patrick Soon-Shiong, ABC News, which is owned by the Disney company, and the owner of the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos, all on bended knee in front of the Trump temple. The cartoon rough was rejected outright by the editorial page editor with no convincing rationale. Soon after her own departure in March from the Washington Post after a 40-year career, former deputy editorial page editor Ruth Marcus wrote in the New Yorker magazine, quote, "The decision to kill it was an instance of obeying in advance," unquote. But before I continue about recent events regarding attacks on satire and free speech, let me briefly explain what an editorial cartoon is and its role in journalism and civic debate. Because while everyone understands and is familiar and enjoys cartoons, not everybody really knows what the role of an editorial cartoonist is. We live in the opinions section along with columnists, but instead of the written word, we use images. Our job is to expose abuses of power and injustices committed by governments and institutions. With ridicule, irony, exaggeration, and caricature, we provoke, challenge, irritate, and frankly, make powerful people angry. That's why autocrats, especially, do not like editorial cartoons which target them. They don't like their corrupt actions being exposed, and they don't like being laughed at. And specifically because of the visual language and the universal reach images have, cartoonists will always be first in the line of fire when controversial subjects are being debated and free speech threatened. We've seen that sad fact before with the Danish cartoon controversy in 2005. A group of Danish cartoonists were targeted for the cartoons they drew depicting the Prophet Muhammad. After they were published, there were worldwide protests, and many of the cartoonists involved had to have police protection for years afterwards. And of course, the horrific attack on the offices of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo in 2015. 5 cartoonists were murdered in cold blood because there are people who believe that violence is an appropriate response to cartoons they deem as offensive to their religious beliefs. After an initial outpouring of support for freedom of expression both here and overseas, cries of "Je suis Charlie" turned into a debate about what images should be allowed in cartoons and where the red line is. Even in this country, liberal writers and even some fellow cartoonists didn't turn out to support free speech after all, and called for restrictions on what images cartoonists should be allowed to draw. Just a couple of months ago, I participated on a cartoonist panel at a journalism conference in France. The event listed myself and 2 other cartoonists in addition to a special guest, who wasn't publicly revealed, not even to myself and the other panelists. It turned out to be the cartoonist Reese, the current publisher and editor of Charlie Hebdo. I counted at least a 6-person security detail accompanying him. Even after 10 years, he still has police protection 24 hours a day. I have mentioned in earlier interviews how I believe attacks on satirists are a warning and will lead to broader censoring of free speech. Like other autocrats, Trump has made no secret of his dislike for anyone who criticizes him, from journalists who ask probing questions to satirists who ridicule him. Recently, we have seen more attacks on satire by media companies trying to keep in Trump's good graces. Stephen Colbert's popular late-night talk show on CBS was canceled after he criticized the network for settling a $16 million lawsuit with Trump, describing it as a big fat bribe. The timing was suspect since Paramount, the network's parent company, was looking to get approval from the FCC for a merger with Skydance Media worth $8.4 billion. The recent killing of the right-wing podcaster, Charlie Kirk, further illustrates the troubling development of a broadening attack on satire and free speech. Just 2 weeks ago, ABC, which is owned by the Walt Disney Company, suspended Jimmy Kimmel's late-night talk show because of comments Kimmel made during his monologue. Trump's FCC chairman, Brendan Carr, then threatened federal action against ABC affiliates who carried Kimmel's show. Sounding more like a mobster than a public servant, Carr issued this threat: "Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead." But more importantly, most of the attention that was on Jimmy Kimmel being suspended, but most importantly, there were also many others: teachers, government employees, firefighters, members of the military, ordinary Americans who were targeted because they joked about the killing or made disparaging comments on social media. As he hosted the late Kirk's podcast, Vice President Vance called for the right-wing supporters to track down and harass anyone who wasn't perceived to have sufficiently mourned Kirk. Hell, call their employer, Vance said, and encouraged. Attorney General Pam Bondi, let me emphasize that, the Attorney General of the United States, said in an interview, quote, "There's free speech and then there's hate speech. And there is no place, especially now, especially after what happened to Charlie, for that in our society." Bondi added, "We will absolutely target you, go after you if you are targeting anyone with hate speech," unquote. Now, I'm a cartoonist and I'm not a lawyer, but even I know that the so-called hate speech is protected under the First Amendment. Bondi did walk back her comments after outrage from some prominent Republicans, but that she even said it should be troubling to anyone who's worried over recent developments about satire and free speech. I'm a member of the advisory board for the Geneva-based Freedom Cartoonist Foundation, as well as a former board member of Cartoonist Rights. Over the past 20 years, I've watched my overseas colleagues risk their livelihoods and sometimes even their lives to defend freedom of expression in their drawings. In 2011, Syrian cartoonist Ali Farsat had both his hands broken after he criticized the autocratic Assad regime through his cartoons. As I mentioned previously, there was the Danish cartoon controversy and the Charlie Hebdo murders. Also in 2015, Iranian artist Atana Faragandi was arrested for a cartoon criticizing her country's legislators for a law that would have set back Iranian women's reproductive health decades. She was beaten during a 9-hour interrogation and sentenced to prison for over 12 years. Fortunately, because of international pressure by cartoon and human rights organization, Atana was released and is currently out of harm's way, but the threat of her being targeted again is still very real. More recently, an Egyptian cartoonist, Ashraf Omar, is being held in detention because of cartoons criticizing the Egyptian government. As stated in the United Nations press release, the case of Ashraf Omar illustrates a deeply worrying practice in Egypt of criminalizing political expression, including in the form of art, under the guise of national security and counterterrorism. While editorial cartoonists and satirists in the United States haven't yet had to deal with risk of imprisonment, we still do have our First Amendment rights. There is a different danger with Trump as president. When he was first elected in 2016, my concern then was Trump's notoriously thin skin when it came to being ridiculed. And I worried that this would result in him targeting editorial cartoonists. Although he threatened to change the libel laws against journalists, he still does to this day, he never got around to targeting the editorial cartoonist. But now in his second administration, he doesn't need to. American newspapers and media companies are doing it for him by obeying in advance. As with my own experience at the Washington Post, many publishers and media executives have no feelings of obligation to protecting free speech and are more concerned with protecting their financial interests. As the Colbert cancellation and Kimmel suspension show us, satirists risk losing their livelihoods because of Trump's determination to silence any criticism against him. We are in a perilous time. Civil liberties, universities, judges, and the free press are all being threatened. If cartoonists and comedians continue to face censorship and cancellation by media companies not willing to stand up to threats from Trump and his administration, our democracy loses essential voices in a public and political debates. A silenced cartoonist or a canceled late-night comedian are warnings to us all that everyone's free speech will eventually be targeted. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, so much. And now, as you can see, Anne is being joined by Roslyn Mazer. And I want to introduce you to Roslyn. She's a retired attorney who worked for many years in the Washington, D.C. area. She earned early distinction in First Amendment advocacy through her representation of editorial cartoonists in the Hustler magazine versus Falwell case, which we'll be talking about a little bit. Her extremely entertaining friend of the court brief with an appendix of historical editorial cartoons is widely credited with shaping the 1988 ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court protecting satire under the First Amendment. And for those of you out there that aren't familiar with this case, I have to say that, as I always tell my students, the idea that satire is protected by the First Amendment, we didn't always have that ruling. It was this case that established that, and it's tremendously important for that reason. In 2018, I've said I've welcomed both Roslyn and Ann back because in 2018, Roslyn co-curated with me a 2-day symposium here at the University of Minnesota. It was called The State of Our Satirical Union, when we hosted 10 Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonists who gathered to talk about their profession, new forms of satire, and threats to cartoonists both here and abroad. Roslyn has moderated programs about cartooning at the Library of Congress, at Hofstra University, Syracuse University, and numerous other professional gatherings for lawyers and journalists. And she's been referred to as the cartoonist patron saint. I'm delighted to welcome Roslyn back, and they're now going to have a conversation. I'm going to eavesdrop, and after that conversation is over, we are going to open it up to your questions. So that's the order of the evening. So please, Roslyn and Ann, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ann and Jane. And Jane, I want to join Ann in celebrating your career as a journalist, as the executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, and your years of teaching and scholarship here at the University of Minnesota. The First Amendment has had no greater champion than you. You've been a marvelous teacher, scholar, comrade in arms with those who have been challenged, and a great champion of free expression. And I join everyone here and everyone online in celebrating your wonderful career. Well, Ann, satire is having quite a moment.
Yeah.
And I thought we'd start tonight by celebrating a wonderful cartoonist known to all of you here and many around the country and around the world. The wonderful Steve Sack, who drew for the Minnesota paper, the Star Tribune, for over 40 years, is with us here tonight. And Steve, would you stand up for just a moment so we can recognize you? So let's start looking at one of Steve's wonderful cartoons with First Principles. Free expression in the United States is still unique in the world. No other country enjoys the freedom we have to criticize and ridicule our leaders. But you know, it was just a wink ago, just 60 years ago, that the United States Supreme Court constitutionalized under the First Amendment the right to do so in the famous bedrock case, New York Times versus Sullivan, which we'll be talking about a little later. Before that, each of our 50 states could decide how to punish speech, whether through libel laws, privacy laws, or more arcane common law torts, such as intentional infliction of emotional distress. The fact is that over the years, really over the centuries, readers and viewers have formed deep personal connections with cartoonists. I know all of you here who've enjoyed Steve Sack over the decades have done so. Cartooning and ridicule started many, many centuries ago. Satire began with the ancient Greeks, but in more recent centuries, cartoons began with crude copperplate engravings and then morphed into lithographs, then into caricatures and standalone cartoons in the great magazines of the 19th century, Puck and Judge. And then in 20th century, the cartoons really flourished with hundreds of cartoonists hired by daily newspapers as an important part of their draw. And readers enjoyed them, were provoked by them, got angry with them, laughed at them. But the point of, as Anne said, of editorial cartooning is to make a point. And there's a reason why they're on the editorial page and in the opinion section. Readers across the country enjoyed over many years the likes of Jeff McNelly, Tony Auth, Patrick Oliphant, Paul Conrad, Herb Block. I see a lot of people nodding. These are people we were really close to and were part of our political education over many, many years. This is one of Anne's remarkable drawings, and I would love, Anne, for you to talk about this. You sounded an alarm tonight about what some have called our free speech recession. As you've traveled around the world and you've seen how the freedoms we enjoy are not shared in other regimes, in autocratic regimes, how do you think about the freedoms we now enjoy against the backdrop of colleagues of yours who are threatened with exile and worse?
Yeah, I used to always say that to my colleagues too when I was over there. You know, we have our First Amendment rights, which of course is our protection to do this. That cartoon I did right after the Colbert cancellation was announced, because I just felt as though we're sort of getting into some bad territory here. I have to be honest, I'm worried. You know, I mean, I know it's the First Amendment and everything, but I worry that we are going to see more of a pushback from this administration about, you know, who can make jokes about the president, especially. You know, the Jimmy Kimmel thing was really interesting. I don't know if any of you guys went back and looked at his monologue that he did right before he was suspended. But you know, they said it was because of a quote that he said about MAGA being, you know, the shooting of Kirk was due to just MAGA people, and that wasn't really, I think, the issue. I think the issue was he had been really hitting hard on Trump, really hard. I mean, and if you go back to some of his other monologues, he has been very critical, as Colbert has been. So yeah, I find it distressing. I mean, I used to just sort of say, oh yeah, we have our First Amendment. Now I don't know anymore.
You know, if you look at what Viktor Orban and other autocrats, for sure Vladimir Putin, did in 2000, when there was even a glimmer of hope that he might move the country more toward a more progressive agenda. He got oligarchs together to buy the company that was featuring puppets that ridiculed him and Yeltsin and other Russian rulers. I think it was called Kulka.
Yeah.
You know, wildly popular show of puppets who were satirical caricatures of the leaders in Russia. And sure enough, and this echoes today, you know, the oligarchs who bought the company that sponsored the show got rid of the show. So, no, I certainly share the concern that, no, President Trump fancies himself aligned with some autocratic behaviors like that.
Sure.
You know?
Absolutely.
So this is the cartoon
This
that
is the
Anne was
rough.
speaking about,
Yeah.
that led to her
And
quitting the
cartoonists,
post.
yeah, and cartoonists can relate with me on this. It's always the cartoon, the drawing you're not most proud of, that gets the most attention. You know, as I said, it was a rough. The way that it worked at the Washington Post, at least for me and other cartoonists there, is I had always chosen my subject matter. I was never told what I had to do a cartoon on, so that was my choice, and that never changed. And then I would do a rough that would ultimately get approved by the editorial page editor. I had a kind of in-between editor that brought these roughs to him, as did other cartoons have different editors. And you know, usually I'm like any other editorial cartoonist, and Steve can probably attest to this, is, you know, you get edited one way or the other, you know, when you're working for a newspaper. Usually it's something like, it's not really, doesn't really make any sense. Can you strengthen it. A little uncomfortable with that image, but this time it just came back no. And I had never had that before. And I said, no, what does that mean? Oh, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that subject. I'm like, why? So that's kind of, as I said, I wasn't planning to quit. I really did want to continue working at the Washington Post because I thought it was important, especially since Trump had won re-election, that I continue, to do my job. And I just didn't feel like I could go ahead and do it at that point. So I had a long conversation with the editorial page editor, and I didn't get the impression anything would change. So I just decided within 5 minutes to quit.
This is a wonderful, wonderful cartoon. I'd love to hear what the circumstances were that led to it. But to my mind, it brings to mind the power of satire. You spoke a little bit about this. George Orwell said, every joke is a tiny revolution. And there's just a lot of truth to that. The power of satire to pierce through all the cacophony of our political discourse and come up with simple truths and simple insights about political events endures.
Yeah, this is actually a panel that some of you have that little bookmark that you got. It was an explainer about editorial cartooning and what we do. And we're like the court jesters. We poke fun at the people in power, and I think it's important. As I said, it's important for a democracy that you're allowed to do that. And when people start telling you can't or threaten you, then you start getting into an erosion of freedom of speech.
So we're about to talk for a few minutes about the Hustler case that Anne mentioned and Jane mentioned. Before we do, for the scholars and students and faculty here and listening, since the Hustler case was decided, these 37 years ago, there has been a true explosion of research on why satire is so effective, why it breaks through and communicates so clearly to viewers and readers. There have been studies of MRIs of the brain as it receives satirical material and irony, and showing what parts of the brain are stimulated by satire. It's truly remarkable, the scholarship that has taken off around the world, not just in the United States, about why satire is so uniquely powerful. So I commend viewers who are interested in this to plow into that material. It's not just that it communicates opinions, it communicates them forcefully and directly and sharply and vividly. And that's why, among other reasons, it's so important for our debate. I'll note, by way of footnote, that The Onion, one of the great satirical publications, has decided to go back to a print publication because in recent years it has become so popular, especially with young people. And as we know, satire, whether it's The Daily Show or Colbert or other late night shows, has become a critically important source of news, especially for young people. The data that shows how young people are consuming news shows that by and large it's drifting far away from daily newspapers long ago, but moving toward online platforms where satire is so readily available and readily consumed. So here we have the infamous Campari liquor ad parody, which is the publication that started the long march to the Supreme Court to save satire. This, briefly, was a parody published by Hustler magazine that ridiculed Reverend Jerry Falwell, who had headed the Moral Majority, a movement of political and religious conservatives that came to the fore in the 1970s and was extremely successful in raising funds through online ministries and to field candidates of the conservative bent. They were virulently anti-abortion, anti-pornography, anti-homosexual, and they were extremely popular. Well, Larry Flint and Hustler magazine decided to take him down a peg or two and publish this takeoff on the Campari liquor ad campaign, When Was Your First Time? Except it depicted Folo's first time as being with his mother. Pretty crude as these things go. And there is a disclaimer at the bottom, ad parody not to be taken seriously. Nonetheless, Reverend Folo went to court and eventually won a $200,000 verdict that included punitive damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case went up to the Fourth Circuit, which affirmed the judgment with notable dissent by Judge J. Harvey Wilkinson III, which I commend to all of you free speech champions as one of the great celebrations of the First Amendment. Through the website oye.org, we have the opportunity to hear Chief Justice Rehnquist now in his colloquy at the oral argument.
Well, what about a cartoonist who sits down at his easel or whatever cartoonists sit down at and thinks to himself, candidate X for the presidency is just a big windbag, a pompous turkey, and I'm going to draw this cartoon showing him as such. You know, part of his intent, he enjoys cartooning and just likes to make people look less than they are, to show up the dark side of people. But he knows perfectly well that's going to create emotional distress in this particular person. Now, does that meet your test? No.
Yes. So, as Jane mentioned in her remarks, Chief Justice Rehnquist, who wrote for the unanimous court that the verdict against Reverend Folo could not stand in the face of the First Amendment, and he said, an outrageousness standard runs afoul of our long-standing refusal to allow damages to be awarded because the speech in question may have an adverse emotional impact on the audience. We conclude that public figures and public officials may not recover for the tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress by reason of publications such as the one here, without showing, in addition, that the publication contains a false statement of fact, which was made with actual malice, using the standard from the New York Times case. This is not merely a blind application of the New York Times standard. It reflects our considered judgment that such a standard is necessary to give adequate breathing space to the freedoms protected by the First Amendment. And the Statue of Liberty cartoons you've driven echo back to a number of your cartoonist forebears. And I wondered if we could take a few moments. I don't think we spend enough time when we have the opportunity and the privilege to talk to cartoonists, to talk about their inspirational forebears and their journey as artists. So Anne is going to talk about a few of her inspirations.
Yeah, and just to back up a little bit, unlike a lot of my colleagues, I didn't actually intend to become an editorial cartoonist. I was trained as an animator, so I had different types of inspirations for that. But I did get Newsweek, and if you're old enough to remember, Newsweek had a weekly roundup of cartoonists, and they had Oliphant, and they had McNelly and Lukovich. And then, of course, I knew and had books of Herblock, who was the longtime editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post. And I mean, I come from an art background, so I'm always looking at the art. And his drawings are so solid, so beautifully drawn. If you ever get a chance to go to the Library of Congress, please go ask to see some of their originals, because it's really amazing to see what he was doing in the 50s and 40s and 50s, especially. But talking about, everybody likes to laugh at cartoons, everybody likes humor, but, Herblock, if you don't know, actually came up with the term McCarthyism, because he did a cartoon where he wrote that in there, and he was a fierce critic of Joseph McCartney. Um, he he just pounded on him constantly until finally he was, basically driven out of what he was doing. Um, and and I think that's an important thing to say. I think the next, maybe show the next. This is Malden. This is, if you might remember, back in World War II, he was very well known for a series that he did of two young GIs, Willie and Joe, right? Yeah. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for it. He, of course, as soon as the war was over and the syndicates wanted him to continue drawing, but he wanted to do drawings about civil liberties and racism. And it was controversial, but as an editorial cartoonist, he felt like that's what he needed to do, and he did. And I think there's one more. Um, you know, and the syndicate didn't like it because they wanted him to continue just doing the Willie and Joe. So that was a battle that he had. Another cartoonist that, of course, next one is Pat Oliphant. Pat Oliphant is an amazing drafts person, just amazing. And funny too, because you're laughing at him. And he took on a subject matter that was tough. It was about the sexual cases in the Catholic Church, and he did a lot of cartoons about the Catholic Church and the Vatican, and he got a lot of pushback. But he was right. And this is my favorite cartoon, probably ever. Is the
If you can't read the caption, it's Celebration of Spring at St. Pedophilia's, the annual running of the altar boys.
Running of the altar boys, yeah.
Yeah.
This is another one you might not have heard of. He was Osborne. He was a illustrator during the 40s and 50s and 60s, I believe, when magazines were really big. And I just loved his simple style. I tried to copy it, and of course I couldn't.
Yeah. Tell us about this cartoon.
This is the cartoon I did when Trump won a second term, which is interesting. I didn't realize until Roslyn showed me she was going to put this in the slideshow. If you show the next one, that's the one I did after his first term. I didn't plan it. I just felt that way. It was a big surprise both times, actually, when he won for me. The first one, I was actually drawing a cartoon about what a momentous time it was for a woman to become president, and I had to put that aside, obviously. And of course, the second time, I think I realized a little bit earlier what was going on, but it was, just sometimes a cartoon isn't funny, an editorial cartoon. And I think that's what people have to understand is, even though we do use humor in what we do, that's not our purpose. We're supposed to have a point of view, and that's what I wanted to express at that point.
So I think when you pull the lens back and think about where we've come as a country, in many ways, this last century has brought us full circle, because the acknowledgments of the Supreme Court in recent years celebrating and protecting First Amendment and free expression didn't start out owning a majority in the court. And I'm always eager to bring to audiences who may not know it the case that really started the march of the last century toward free expression. And it came from a dissent by Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who had fought in the Civil War, had been injured 3 times, served on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court for 20 years before he was placed on the Supreme Court. And in the famous case involving Jacob Abrams, Justice Holmes only commanded one other vote, Justice Brandeis, in his ringing dissent from the upholding of a conviction under syndicalism law that were passed by many states during World War I, when there were fears of Russian radicalism moving from Russia to the United States. And this is the ringing quote from that dissent, which I think echoes across the years to today. He said, "I think we should be eternally vigilant against attempts to check the expression of opinions that we loathe and believe to be fraught with death, unless they so imminently threaten immediate interference with the lawful and present purposes of the law that an immediate check is required to save the country." That opinion ultimately won a majority of the court in ensuing cases. And in looking at the speech that is currently under fire and the subject of executive orders in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, this before you in the Brandenburg case would happen to be a Ku Klux Klansman, is the current state of the law. The constitutional guarantees of free speech and free press do not permit a state to forbid or proscribe advocacy of the use or force of law violation, except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. Now, that is still the law. And I wanted to discuss with Anne our sort of mutual concerns about what the current Supreme Court might do with the New York Times versus Sullivan and Hustler cases and the Brandenburg case in an environment now where the circumstances are so fraught and there's such divisiveness in the country that there's a whipped up furor to punish speech, as you were saying, not just government executive orders and the like, but cheering on the punishment by the private sector of online or other criticism of Mr. Kirk or others. And I wonder what your concerns are as a cartoonist, and I'll talk a little bit about my concerns as well.
Yeah, I mean, and to be honest, I mean, as you can tell, I'm a pretty liberal cartoonist. You know, the thing that I've noticed in the last several years is that it's not just attacks from the right; it's also attacks from the left. You know, about what you're drawing and you know, and challenging things that you draw, and I find that really troubling because that really means that it's a real. I mean, I feel it's a real bad time for free speech, and it leads to things like the Charlie Hebdo situation, and that always concerns me. So I don't know what that is. Is that because we don't learn about the First Amendment? Is it people don't understand? I can't tell you how many people have told me, well, hate speech is illegal. I'm like, not really. You know, we don't know that, and people get upset about things that are drawn and said. But drawings, you know, going back to what you said about drawings, I think that the power of editorial cartoons is the fact they are images. You know, everybody can relate to images, and you don't have to speak the language. That's why we're always getting in trouble for these cartoons when they go overseas. But yeah, I'm concerned on both sides, frankly. I want people to be more tolerant for what other people are saying. I mean, I get insulted all the time. When I started in this business, nothing against you, Steve, you're a man, but all my male colleagues did a lot of really sexist cartoons. You know, that's just the way it was. It was in the early 90s. It was more accepted. I didn't feel as though they should be thrown in jail. I mean, I just told them. I said, that's really sexist, you know? So I guess I just would like to see more people understand how important it is to have this free speech.
Well, I'm going to tie that to the speaker of last year's lecture, Jacob Changama, who said that what we need is a robust and resilient culture of free speech. And I do not think we have that. I think and Jane and you and I and our generation, free speech was in our mitochondria. We grew up believing in it. It was something that was just part of our core. And I think you touched on the fraught atmosphere in university communities around the country, both on all sides of all hot button issues. There is now a very strong impulse to censor speech, to walk out if and say your feelings are hurt. Lord knows this is a world where feelings can be hurt. That there are strong feelings about wars and about culture and about sexual preferences and uh, abortion and a million different topics. But the atmosphere now, as you said, and more or less the last 10 years or so, feels to have gotten to a point where we no longer can rely on that sort of baseline feeling and commitment to this great experiment. So I think civics education, among other things, is vital to revitalize, because without it, everyone will just be going to their corners and reading the opinions they agree with, and we will not have a productive debate and move ahead.
Yeah, it's funny when I deal with international cartoonists, especially the women cartoonists, because there's not a lot of us, and especially in countries that women really do have second-class status, there's even fewer. But I have found that whenever I speak with these cartoonists, especially the women cartoonists from the Arab countries, they are so pro free speech, because they know that if there are restrictions on that free speech, they'll be the first to suffer. So, I try to use that example sometime when I'm trying to explain to people how important it is to allow people to say anything stupid they want. And you can do your own cartoon against them, and you can criticize them, and you can protest against them. You just can't kill them. It's as simple as that.
I wondered, as I've watched the coverage of the tragic killing of Charlie Kirk and the ensuing events, I wonder if any city or town in the United States could turn out 120,000 people in favor of free speech.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. But I want to be sure that we allow time for our audience to ask questions. And Jane, were you going to help facilitate that?
So thank you both for that really interesting discussion. I think I really want to emphasize how really important Roslyn's friend of the court brief was in the Falwell case. I was at the Reporters Committee at the time, and we did our own friend of the court brief, and I'll tell you, it wasn't nearly as good and as powerful as what Roslyn was able to provide, with great argument, but ultimately with the illustration of the fact that a history of satire goes back all the way to the founding of this country and is so embedded in our, American genes that there really should be no question that it's of value and, in fact, is essential as one of the many escape valves we need in our often tense society.
One quick footnote to that, thank you, Jane, is that the law students here and law faculty know well that two of our sitting justices, Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch, have, in opinions they've written in recent years, welcomed the court to revisit the holding of New York Times versus Sullivan, that 1964 bedrock case that extends broad protection against libel verdicts. And they come at it from different perspectives. Justice Thomas believed that the New York Times versus Sullivan case was just a made-up construct that was advancing policy goals that really wasn't grounded in constitutional law, his originalism argument. Justice Gorsuch, on the other hand, is concerned that the extraordinary changes in the social media landscape and the distribution of power, the concentration of power, all the different changes in the media landscape no longer warrant the protection of New York Times versus Sullivan. And he calls it an ironclad subsidy for protection of speech that shouldn't be protected. So we have 2 sitting justices at least that are calling on litigants to bring a case before them so they can at least chip away, if not outright overturn the case. In my opinion, I think the case lends itself to the kind of chipping away that will end up being like a Jenga game where you pull apart different parts and pretty soon the whole exercise collapses and our free speech would go with it. So it's something to watch for to see if, in fact, they confront a case like that in coming years.
The irony of it is that, of course, people on all sides of the political spectrum have been the beneficiary of New York Times versus Sullivan. And I think for many years, it was the belief that the Supreme Court, no matter what side they approached it from, would maintain that simply out of self-interest, if nothing else. But I agree that the tide is changing and we need to be alert. Okay, so now we have 2 people here with microphones. If you would raise your hand, you'll be given a chance to ask a question. We ask that you keep your questions short and to the point. I know that's hard to do in a setting like this because many of you have very strong feelings about the things you've been hearing tonight. But in the interest of time and to allow everybody a chance to be heard, we do ask that. And for our online audience, type your questions into the Q&A box and Stuart will curate your questions and pass them along to me. So do we have any questions?
Hello, question for you. Is there a call to action? What can we do?
A call to act. Well, okay. Yes, you can go out and protest. Absolutely. I get people that comment on my Substack. They have asked me before if they can use cartoons to put on posters. Yes, use them, please. It really does make a difference if you get out. I mean, I know it feels kind of futile sometimes, but they really. What is that? Roslyn? What is the study they did about how many percentage of people going out and protesting results in autocrats being overthrown? There is an actual study out there. Yeah, and it has to be the tipping point. You have to get out there and be loud. I think that they've already noticed this, that people are angry and want to speak their piece, and just get out there and vote.
And state legislatures are actually becoming quite interesting, and state constitutions can provide additional levels of protection or go in the other direction. And so this isn't all federal. There are lots of things going on at the state and local, even the local level, with ordinances that are tightening restrictions on protests and the like. So at every level of government, in terms of government coercion and government intrusion on free expression, there are many nonprofits and other organizations and academic organizations that are monitoring what's going on in terms of new laws and enforcement that might be selective and going against speech, certain kinds of speech. So, being informed citizens is the call to action for all of us.
And I would add to that to speak out, because remember that after the Charlie Kirk murder, there was outcry from those who were fans of him, loud and sustained, that was heard by people in government, by people in business. And if you disagree with that, the old saw about how old age is not for sissies, well, free speech is not for sissies. And I think we have to stand up to that and realize that if you disagree with that approach, you need to be heard, you need to speak up. And on that topic, one of our online questions, which I think is related to this, is without naming anyone, do you know of any editorial cartoonists, Anne, who are self-censoring for fear of retribution or consequences to their career?
I know it's happened. Yes. I remember very clearly after 9/11, a lot of cartoonists were self-censoring because of what they got from their editors, the feeling, where I remember I remember one of my colleagues told me that his editor actually said, don't do any cartoons against the Bush administration. Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't doubt
So
that.
it happens. Yeah.
And the irony is that I think, at times of national crisis, like 9/11 clearly was, editorial cartoons can be really important. Satire helps, I think, people to process this. And even by finding absurdity and humor in some kinds of the unthinkable, you can grapple with it and think critically about it. So, I'm all in favor of editorial cartoonists tackling these topics because, as I said earlier, I think they're an escape valve for times when people are most distressed and unsure of what to do. Enough editorializing for me. Questions? We'll get to you, Steve.
I've drawn an immigration court and have summoned the Statue of Liberty. And I was wondering when you first started summoning her courage in your drawings.
Oh, you mean the Statue of Liberty when I started? Well, we always deal with visual metaphors, right? And of course, the Statue of Liberty stands for America. It stands for it stands for a lot of things. I found that during the first Trump administration, I was using her as well as Lady Justice quite a bit, and it seemed to fit very well considering his sexism, misogyny as well. So now I use it quite a bit. But it's just like it's one of our visual metaphors that we use. I mean, Uncle Sam used to be a big one. I would say probably more when I first started, but he never resonated with me. I always wanted to put the women in there.
Steve Sack has a question down here.
No, I'm sorry. We're not going to take that.
We believe in freedom of speech here, Anne. We got to give him a chance.
First of all, I want to apologize for the male cartoonists in the 1990s hurting your delicate female feelings.
Yes.
My question is, did you have a conversation with Jeff Bezos about your cartoon, or did he address your case in any other form or manner?
No, and that's something, I'm sure that I remember reading about this, that people would say, oh, Jeff Bezos, censored the cartoon. I have no idea if he saw it. Probably not. Well, eventually he saw it, yeah. But I mean, when it was being when it wasn't approved, I think actually it was, basically what Ruth Marcus wrote about. It was an instance of obeying in advance for this editorial page editor, knowing, that he didn't want to do this. So I don't honestly think he had a hand in it. I don't know, I really don't know. I said, yeah.
We have two related questions from online that I'm going to combine kind of into one. One is for you, Anne, which is, do you find solo publishing in your Substack online as effective as being with the Post? Do you have an editor, and are there protections against harassment for you?
Well, obviously, working for the Washington Post gives you a very large platform. So I mean, I have over 100,000 subscribers, but I had more eyeballs on my work at the Post. So, that was obviously a reason why I didn't want to quit, but I felt I had to. Do I have an editor? Yeah, me. Unfortunately, I am a really rotten speller, and I have done quite a few of those, and my readers have told me. So that's handy. What was the last part?
Do you have any protection?
Oh, well, this is what I do. It's kind of a weird protection, but so I have free subscribers, which you're welcome to do. You can see pretty much everything, but I only allow my paid subscribers to comment because I figured you probably like me. And it's not that I need good comments. It's just that it kind of keeps the crazies out sometimes because I did get a lot of those before. It's really interesting about the whole thing about getting comments on your work, as Steve knows, going from just the print pages where the only thing that someone could do is basically write in a letter to the editor, right? And then eventually you'd find out about it. Once the internet came on, for me, I was a freelancer at the time. I loved it because I had a reach finally. I finally had people overseas seeing my work. I also had every single misogynistic idiot contacting me and my work as well. We all deal with stuff. We all deal with threats. Sometimes it gets worse than others. So it's just part of the job.
What do you what do you feel as like the political landscape going forward with the Trump administration looks like?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear it.
What do you think the political landscape and journalism coverage will look like with the rest of Trump's administration?
What journalism coverage will look like for the rest of the Trump administration? Well, if the first 9 months are any indication, I think it's going to continue to be fraught. I mean, he and he and his press secretary have tried to sideline and the Associated Press and then others and the Pentagon. They're cracking down on access to the building and requiring this signing of some sort of pledge in order to be able to cover Pentagon matters. I think there's just continuing efforts to constrict access and coverage. Today, there was a broadside assault on oversight. And we know that, and this affects political coverage because I happen to serve in my public service part of my career in the inspector general community. And today, I believe inspectors general were referred to as debris in the speech at Quantico, one of the speeches at Quantico. And inspectors general in the federal oversight community, including the General Accounting Office and the auditors and others who are checks on the federal government, have been hollowed out. And there haven't been appointments of Senate confirmed federal inspectors general, or very few. And without them issuing objective, factual reports on what's happening in our government, the political coverage is going to suffer because those reports really command public attention, as they should, because it holds government officials' feet to the fire. It makes sure that money is spent wisely and that there's ethical violations or other legal violations. So I think journalists are going to continue to struggle to cover the balance of the Trump administration, and the organizations that Jane is affiliated with and champions of free speech and free expression are going to have their work cut out for them to continue to try to gain access and cover our government. It's our government.
Thank you so much for coming, first of all, and speaking. I have a question for you about the role of independent publications. Given that we're seeing younger people are increasingly divesting away from major news outlets as a source of their news, how do you feel that artists will respond to this? Do you see that independent publishing will become very lucrative for artists who want more creative control, freedom of speech?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm not the only one on Substack. You've probably noticed that Paul Krugman, who was with the New York Times, also went to Substack. There are a number of editorial cartoonists that are on Substack. I don't know if it's kind of early for Substack. I'm not quite sure if that'll be the platform. But as you said, it's getting away from legacy media, right? And I think that's important. It's another development we will see. You know, as an editorial cartoonist, I just want to do my job. I just want to do what I did before. I don't want to deal with an editor that doesn't understand that. So I do think it's great for you guys. I always tell younger people, it's like you have the world at your fingertips because you can get your voice out there. You can do what you want online. You don't need, when I first started out, if an editor decided not to publish my cartoon, no one saw it, right? But you can do that. So use it.
I think we have time for one more question. So raise your hand high so we can find you. Yeah.
Over there. No.
Thank you. I want you to clearly draw an example of how you, as a cartoonist, govern yourself. And think of the week of Christmas in the United States. We're mostly Christians. It's a very culturally important week. You probably wouldn't do a cartoon that criticized the beliefs around Christmas. So I want to know from both of you, how do you govern yourself? How do you know when you shouldn't do something based on the culture? I think that's really important because you can't do everything, because there's a fine line between garbage drawings and political commentary through cartooning. So tell me how you draw that line. Give some examples of when you said, I can't do this because of the culture or because whatever rationale.
Well, first of all, editorial cartoonists do not attack people's personal beliefs, okay? We can address institutions. Like I have done plenty of cartoons about the Catholic Church because frankly, the Catholic Church inserts itself in a political argument, into political issues. The Catholic Church affects all women throughout the world because of what they try to about their policies. They don't. So I'm a little bit hesitant about your question because you're saying I shouldn't do a cartoon about Christmas because it's attacking someone's personal beliefs. I don't do that. But I don't think that there should be a limit on what I'm allowed to comment on. I'm a Christian. I mean, I'm not practicing one, but I was raised, as a Christian. But it doesn't mean that I can't comment on that. Your question also kind of brings up something else: is who's making that decision? What's okay and what's not for a cartoon? Do you have an answer for that?
So you've got to respect the culture at the time in the environment. And during the week of Christmas, most Americans, the cultural activities around Christmas and Jesus Christ and Christianity are very important to most Americans, and probably would be ill-advised to do a cartoon that say disparage Jesus Christ, disparage the traditions of Christmas in the United States. So there's times when you wouldn't want to do that. And also 4th of July, you probably wouldn't necessarily rip on the United States.
Sure, I would. Sure, I would.
That you could be more patriotic during that time?
No. No, I'm sorry. I don't agree with that. Of course.
I want to sort of associate myself with where and be respectful, absolutely respectful of where you're coming from, because I think a lot of people share your point of view. But the point of an editorial cartoon is to provoke that discussion. And if a cartoonist draws something on July 4th that has a hideous image of American flag or around Christmas, something that takes on something that the church has done that offends people, it's designed to provoke that debate. It's not that the cartoonist is disrespectful of the country. The cartoonists love our country and love their right to say what they want to say. But I absolutely respect where you're coming from, and I think that's the point, to have the discussion. And if it offends you and it offends others that cartoonists touch on cultural issues that are, just so poignant and so painful, that's the world we live in.
Tell us what is too far. What will you not?
Well, a cartoonist is never going to say that. A First Amendment lawyer is never going to say that. And certainly the government shouldn't say that.
Roslyn quoted from the Hustler case, and I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially the court had been asked to set an outrageousness standard, that some things were just too outrageous to be tolerated. And Chief Justice Rehnquist basically said, if we could figure out where to draw that line, maybe we might consider doing that, but we can't, because the wealth of disagreement and strong viewpoints and conflict in this country, it's impossible to define what is outrageous without stifling legitimate debate, discussion, and satire.
Right.
And so I think that's the problem, that we're not going to agree if we took a poll in this room on what is too outrageous to be tolerated. And it's up to the cartoonists to keep pushing that envelope.
In 2011, I'll add, there was a very touchy, controversial case called Snyder versus Phelps. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion for the court. It was an 8-1 opinion. And you may remember that this was a case involving the picketing by the Westboro Baptist Church of a military funeral of a Marine Corps veteran who had died during the Iraq War. And the picketers were on public property. They did not trespass. They did not commit vandalism, but they carried hateful signs and did this all around the country. But this particular funeral so enraged the father of the fallen veteran that he sued. And there was an outrageousness standard in the law that charges were brought under. And in an 8-1 opinion, Chief Justice Roberts reprised the holding in the Hustler case and said, we just cannot square with the First Amendment, as hideous as this is, to have a sober, tragic event like this encumbered by just hateful words and hateful picketing. We just can't square it with the First Amendment, even though the fallen veteran was a private figure, wasn't a public figure, wasn't a public official, didn't sort of bring on himself the debate that ensued. But even then, in 2011, 8-1 with Justice Alito dissenting, set aside the conviction because it couldn't be squared with the First Amendment.
And that's the bottom line, isn't it? To try to stifle this kind of commentary and speech really cannot be squared with the First Amendment. And if that's the only lesson we take away from tonight, I think we've had a valuable evening and a valuable discussion. Please join me in thanking Ann and Roslyn. It was a great discussion. Before we close, I just want to quickly say that if you would like to keep in touch with the Silha Center activities and events, we're already planning our Spring Ethics Forum. Please email us at silha@umn.edu to be added to our mailing list. Thank you and good night.